black billionaire walked into the building she built. Nobody recognized her. They told her to wait in the hallway. 8 minutes later, she fired everyone in that boardroom. If you want to know exactly how she did it, subscribe and keep watching. The cab smelled like pine, air freshener, and old leather, and Diana Monroe hadn't said a single word since George Bush Intercontinental Airport. The driver, a heavy-set black man in his 60s, with graying temples and careful eyes, had glanced at her twice in the rearview mirror, but hadn't pushed conversation. She appreciated that. She was 54 years old, and she had learned, slowly and at great cost, that silence before a storm was not weakness. It was preparation. Houston stretched out ahead of them under a flat Texas sky. Diana had not been back to this city in 6 years. She had left in grief, in exhaustion, in the kind of bone-deep fatigue that comes not from work but from loss. Thomas Garrett had died on a Tuesday in March. The same month, they had always talked about expanding into Southeast Asia, and the world had not paused even briefly to acknowledge that one of the most decent men she had ever known was gone. She had buried him, given the eulogy, shaken 100 hands, and then flown to Cape Cod and sat on her porch for 3 days without moving. She had told herself it was mourning. Later, she understood it was also defeat. The defeat of believing that if you built something honest and strong and true, it would stay that way after you step back from it. The cab turned onto Commerce Street, and Diana saw it before she was ready. Monroe Center. 45 floors of steel and glass rising above the Houston skyline. The letters of her name still gleaming in brushed silver against the morning light. She had not asked Thomas to put her name on the building. He had told everyone else first. The architects, the contractors, the city permit office, half the PR team, and sworn all of them to secrecy with the particular combination of charm and seriousness that Thomas Garrett deployed when he needed people to do something unreasonable. She had found out later that at least 4 people had nearly told her. He had called her to the site on the morning the final letters were installed, under the pretense of reviewing the exterior finishes, and when she arrived, there it was. She had been furious. He had laughed that easy Wyoming laugh of his, the one that could diffuse anything, and said, "You built this place, Di. I just kept the spreadsheets." The cab stopped at the light half a block away, and Diana leaned forward almost unconsciously to look up at the sign. Then she saw it. Thomas Garrett's name, which had once appeared beneath hers in smaller letters along the east face of the building, a detail she had insisted upon after his death, a detail that had been formalized in the founding charter, was gone. The stone panel where his name had been was smooth and blank, freshly resurfaced, as if he had never existed. Diana sat back slowly. The driver cleared his throat. "Miss Monroe." She looked at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were steady and careful and said more than his words. He reached into the center console and held back a small USB drive without turning around. "I used to work on the 31st floor," he said quietly. "My name is Gerald Ford, not the president." He said it without humor. "They let me go 2 years ago for asking questions about the Titan numbers. I found out you were coming back through Owen Reeves. He didn't tell me much, just the date and the flight number, and that I should be at the airport. He said you'd need someone you could trust before you ever walk through that door." He set the USB on the back seat beside her. "Everything on there is time-stamped and encrypted. I've been saving it for 3 years in case you ever came home." Diana looked at the drive for a long moment. Then she picked it up and closed her fingers around it and said, "Thank you, Gerald." "Don't thank me yet," he said. The light turned green. The cab moved forward. Monroe Center filled the windshield like a reckoning. 4 weeks before she got into that cab, Diana had been sitting on the back porch of her Cape Cod house with a glass of iced tea going warm in her hand, watching the Atlantic move in its slow, indifferent way when the notification appeared on her phone. The subject line read, "They erased you. Now they'll erase everything." She almost dismissed it. She received strange emails with some frequency, former employees looking for references, journalists wanting a quote, the occasional conspiracy theorist who believed clean energy technology was suppressed by foreign governments. But something made her open it. Maybe the phrasing, "They erased you." Not they wronged you or they cheated you, but erased. As if she were a mark on a board that inconvenient hands had rubbed away. The body of the email contained no signature, no greeting, just a compressed file of documents that took 11 minutes to download on her coastal internet connection. She poured out the warm tea and made coffee and sat back down and read everything twice. The first read was disbelief. The second was something colder. Victor Caldwell, the man Thomas had handpicked. The man who had stood at Thomas's funeral and spoken about integrity with tears that looked real had been in active negotiation with Titan Fuel Corporation for 14 months. The terms were precise and damning. Apex Clarity, currently valued at $15 billion by independent analysts, would be sold to Titan for $11 billion, $4 billion below market. In an exchange, Caldwell and Craig Sutton, the COO, would receive private stakes in Titan worth a combined $250 million. The company Thomas had built to challenge the fossil fuel industry would become a subsidiary of it. Diana called her attorney that same night. Over the next 10 days, a private forensic accounting firm verified every document. Every signature was authentic. Every wire transfer reference was traceable. And then, on the 11th day, one of the accountants called her with something that made her set down her coffee cup and not pick it up again for a long time. On 3 internal authorization documents that had been used to justify restructuring the board's veto thresholds, someone had signed Diana Monroe's name. Not a forgery that would fool an expert, but a forgery designed to pass casual internal review. Caldwell had used her name, her identity, her founding authority to legally hollow out the protections she had built. That was not a civil violation. That was a crime. On the 14th day, the accountant traced the origin of the anonymous email and found that it had been sent from a registered company device, an internal machine, still active inside Apex Clarity's Houston headquarters. Whoever had sent it was still in that building, still showing up every morning, still sitting in meetings with the people who were stealing everything and carrying the weight of that knowledge alone. Diana booked a one-way flight to Houston the next morning. She did not call ahead. She did not tell her attorney where she was going. She packed one bag, one suit, and the folder of verified documents, and she left before sunrise. Because some reckonings do not improve with delay. The lobby of Monroe Center had been renovated since she last walked through it. The warm, honey-toned wood paneling she had personally selected in 2009, chosen because she wanted the building to feel like a place where people actually lived and worked, not a monument to abstraction, had been replaced with white Italian marble and walls of seamless glass that reflected everything and absorbed nothing. It was colder, more expensive looking, less human. Diana took this in, without breaking stride, and walked toward the reception desk, where a young white woman with immaculate makeup and the kind of composed professional smile that is trained rather than felt looked up at her with eyes that did exactly what Diana had known they would do. They traveled down and up in approximately 1 second, taking in the suit with no visible label, the bag with no recognizable brand, the absence of an assistant or badge, and made their calculation without apparent awareness that a calculation was being made. "Good morning. Can I help you? I'm here for the executive board meeting. Do you have an appointment?" "No." A small pause, gracious and immovable. "I'm sorry. The executive floors require prior authorization. May I ask who referred you?" Before Diana could answer, a Latina woman in her early 30s appeared from the elevator bank with a tablet and sharp, efficient eyes. Her lanyard read Sophie Reyes, Executive Assistant, S. Ophi assessed the situation in a glance and took it over with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing inconvenient variables. "Is there an issue?" "She says she's here for the board meeting. No appointment." Sophie turned to Diana with a particular expression of a person delivering disappointing news to someone they have already decided is not important enough to disappoint thoughtfully. "Ma'am, the executive board is in a closed session right now. They absolutely cannot be interrupted. If you leave your contact information, I can have someone follow up within the week." Diana looked at her for one moment. Then she said, "I'll wait." Sophie gestured toward a row of chairs along the corridor leading to the executive wing, chairs that were clearly designed for vendors and job candidates, and other categories of people who needed to be made to feel they were being accommodated while actually being held at a careful distance. "You can wait there, though I should be honest, it could be quite a while." Diana walked to the chairs and sat down. The leather was cold. From her seat, she could see through the glass walls of the main boardroom. 14 men sat around a long conference table. She counted without meaning to. 13 white faces. One black man, at the far end, pressed to the margin of the room like a footnote. At the head of the table, Victor Caldwell, silver-haired, polished, wearing the easy authority of a man who had never once been asked to wait in a hallway, gestured toward the screen behind him. Titan Fuel Corporation's logo was projected in corporate navy blue. She checked her watch. 1 minute. Two men in business suits she didn't recognize walked in from the street, nodded at Brittany behind the desk, and were waved through to the elevators without a word about appointments or authorization. 3 minutes. A young white male intern passed her with a cardboard tray of coffees, glanced at her, leaned toward his colleague walking beside him, and said something low that made the other one look back at her too. They kept walking. 5 minutes. Sophie Reyes walked past again, and the look she gave Diana was not unkind. It was something worse than unkind. It was pitying. The way a person looks at someone wasting their time on something they simply do not understand. Diana noticed, separately, that the security camera mounted in the corner of the hallway had been rotated approximately 15 degrees from its standard field of view, not recently, she judged, but deliberately. At some earlier point, as though whoever managed this corridor had learned long ago that certain conversations were better left unrecorded. She thought of Thomas. She thought of the garage on Westheimer Road, where they had worked 18-hour days on folding tables, because real desks felt like an extravagance they hadn't earned yet. She thought of the morning he had called her and said, "Di, I think we actually built something real." 8 minutes. She stood up. She did not hurry. Hurrying would have suggested urgency, and urgency would have suggested uncertainty, and Diana Monroe was neither urgent nor uncertain. She walked the length of the corridor with the particular unhurried gravity of a person who understands that the most powerful thing in any room is not volume or velocity but precision. She put her hand on the boardroom door handle. Through the glass, she could see Caldwell mid-sentence, one hand raised in a gesture toward the screen, the other resting on the back of the chair at the head of the table, the chair that had once belonged to Thomas Garrett, and before Thomas had belonged to her. She opened the door. The room went silent, the way rooms go silent when something genuinely unexpected happens. Not the performed silence of a meeting interrupted by a phone, but the drop silence of a room that does not know what it is looking at yet. 14 heads turned. Caldwell's hand froze in the air. Craig Sutton, leaner and sharper, sitting to Caldwell's right, was the first to recover. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the particular edge of a man who has never been interrupted by anyone he considered worth listening to. "This is the closed session. Who let you in?" Diana did not answer. She stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind her and let the silence sit a moment longer than was comfortable. She looked at the room with the slow attention of someone taking inventory. 13 faces she did not recognize, or barely recognized. Caldwell's people, replacements, and loyalists assembled over 6 years. And one face at the far end of the table, pushed so far to the edge he was practically in the wall, that she recognized immediately. Owen Reeves. He had been with Apex Clarity since year 3. A black attorney from Atlanta with a mind like a steel trap and the moral backbone that came from knowing exactly who you were. He looked at her now with an expression that she could only describe as a man watching the ground stop moving after an earthquake. Not relief exactly, but the specific recognition that the thing he had been bracing for had finally arrived. On the screen behind Caldwell, the Titan Fuel presentation was still displayed, and on the second slide, clearly visible from where Diana stood, was her own photograph. Her name beneath it in bold type, Diana Monroe, founder. Building on a legacy of innovation. They were using her face, her name, her reputation, to sell a company she hadn't agreed to sell, to a buyer she had not approved, in a deal she did not know existed. The audacity of it settled over her like something physical. Caldwell stood, buttoned his jacket, and spoke with the measured authority of a man who had rehearsed for this moment without ever actually believing it would arrive. "Ma'am, I'm not sure how you got past the front desk, but this is an executive board meeting of Apex Clarity Corporation. You need to leave this room immediately, or we will have you removed." Owen Reeves stood up. Not loudly, not dramatically. He simply pushed back his chair, straightened to his full height, and said in the clear, unhurried voice of a man who had made his decision long before this moment, "I need to formally state for the record that the woman standing in this doorway is Diana Monroe, founder and 52% majority shareholder of Apex Clarity. Any decision made in this room, without her presence or consent, is not only unauthorized, it is legally void." Diana looked at him across the length of the table. She had wondered, for 4 weeks, who had been sitting in rooms like this one, carrying the weight of what they knew. Now she knew. Owen Reeves had sent that email. She could see it in the way he held her gaze. Not with surprise, but with the specific relief of a man who had waited a very long time for the person he had written to finally walk through the door. The room absorbed this. Two of the younger executives exchanged a glance. Sutton's jaw tightened. Caldwell did not look at Owen. He kept his eyes on Diana, and in them, she saw the thing she had expected to see. Not fear exactly. Not yet. But the first hairline crack in the certainty of a man who had believed for 6 years that the person he'd erased would stay erased. Diana walked to the head of the table. She pulled out the chair. Thomas's chair, her chair, and sat down. "My name is Diana Monroe," she said. Her voice was quiet. It did not need to be anything else. "I own 52% of this company. I have spent the last 8 minutes sitting in the hallway of a building that carries my name, being treated as though I do not belong here." She looked around the table, meeting each pair of eyes in turn, giving each man the full weight of her attention. "So I would like someone to explain to me, who exactly does not belong in this room?" Caldwell recovered faster than she expected. That was the thing about men like Victor Caldwell. They had built entire careers on recovering fast, on reading a room that had turned against them, and finding the sentence that would buy them 30 more seconds, and then 30 more after that, until the momentum shifted back or they found an exit. He settled into a chair slightly removed from the head of the table and folded his hands with the practiced composure of a man who was still, despite everything, certain he was the most powerful person in the room. "Miss Monroe," he said, his tone measured and almost warm. The tone of someone addressing a difficult but not entirely unsympathetic situation. "No one disputes your history with this company, or the significance of your contributions. What you and Thomas built here is extraordinary. But you stepped away from operational leadership 6 years ago. The board and I have been running Apex Clarity since then, and I think by every measurable standard, we have performed well. Your role now, as a majority shareholder, is to attend the annual meeting, review quarterly reports, and vote on major structural decisions. It is not to walk into a closed executive session and make demands." Craig Sutton nodded slowly, adding the practiced gravity of a man who had seconded things his entire career. "With respect, Miss Monroe, shareholders don't attend internal strategy meetings. That's not how governance works." Diana opened her bag. She removed a folder, thick-tabbed, the product of 2 weeks of methodical preparation, and set it on the table. Caldwell looked at it the way a man looks at something he instinctively wants to dismiss, but can't quite make himself dismiss. "What is that?" "Your resignation." Sutton laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, contemptuous in the way that only comes from a person who has not yet understood what is happening. "You have zero authority to, Article 9, Section 4 of the Apex Clarity Founding Charter," Diana said. She opened the folder and laid the relevant page flat on the table, rotating it so it faced the room. "The Phoenix Clause. In the event of gross fiduciary misconduct, deliberate misrepresentation to the board, or any action that fundamentally contradicts the founding mission of this company, the majority shareholder may assume direct operational control and terminate any member of the executive team immediately, without requiring a board vote." Furthermore, she placed her finger on a second paragraph. "The Phoenix Clause automatically suspends and voids all pending transactions entered into during the period under investigation." Caldwell stood. "That clause was amended 18 months ago. The board voted 8-10 to revise it. I have the documentation." He snapped his fingers at an assistant near the wall, who opened a laptop and turned it around to show a signed amendment document with 8 board signatures. A ripple moved through the room. Several executives straightened. Sutton allowed himself a small, tight smile. Diana did not look at the document. She was already pulling another page from her folder. "That vote," she said, "took place on November 14th. According to the bylaws, a quorum of the full board is required for any charter amendment. 14 members. On November 14th, 3 members, Directors Ashworth, Perkins, and Huang, were not notified of the meeting agenda prior to the 24-hour required window." Caldwell had tried to correct it. 6 months after the vote, his legal team had drafted a ratification notice to the 3 absent directors. Ashworth had refused to sign. Perkins had demanded an independent review of the underlying transaction before he would ratify anything. Huang had retained outside counsel. Without all 3 signatures, the ratification was incomplete. And Caldwell had made the calculation that drawing further attention to the procedural flaw was more dangerous than leaving it unresolved. It was the calculation that cost him everything. She laid the proof on the table. 3 email receipts, timestamped, showing notifications sent less than 3 hours before the meeting. Without proper notice, there was no valid quorum. Without a valid quorum, the vote was procedurally void. Diana took out her phone. She dialed. The call connected on the second ring. Office of the Board of Directors, Patricia Shaw. Patricia, this is Diana Monroe. I'm invoking Article 9, Section 4. Authorization Code, Thomas 0317. A pause, longer than Diana expected. Then, Miss Monroe, I need to tell you, there was an attempt 18 months ago to change that code through the executive office. I refuse to process it. The founding charter specifies that the Phoenix Clause authorization code can only be changed by the majority shareholder in person, with notarized documentation. Mr. Caldwell never followed through with the proper procedure. Confirmed, Miss Monroe. The Phoenix Clause is active as of 9:52 a.m. I also need to inform you that I received a request this morning from Mr. Caldwell's office asking me not to accept your calls today. Another pause. I didn't follow that instruction. I know, Patricia. Thank you. She ended the call. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old concrete. At the far end of the table, Owen Reeves let out a breath so quiet it was nearly inaudible, and his hands, which had been gripping the table edge since the moment Diana walked in, finally went still. She spread the documents across the table, the way a surgeon lays out instruments, each one placed deliberately, each one serving a specific purpose, nothing wasted. 14 men watched in the particular silence of people who understand that what is happening in front of them cannot be undone. The financial reports came first. Side-by-side comparisons of the figures presented to the board and the actual internal projections, the gap between them running to hundreds of millions of dollars across 4 fiscal years. Then the Titan fuel negotiation records, 14 months of correspondence, draft term sheets, a final agreement awaiting only the board's rubber stamp. All of it conducted without disclosure to the majority shareholder. Then the compensation schedules. $250 million in private Titan equity structured across shell entities in 3 states, bearing the names of Victor Caldwell and Craig Sutton. Diana let the room sit with those documents for a long moment. She had found, over 54 years of life and 20 years of building things, that silence after evidence lands was often more effective than any argument she could make. There is also this, she said. She pulled out a transcript, clipped and clean, and read aloud without inflection. Monroe will never know. A woman like that, they always step aside when you ask them to. We own this company now. The voice on the recording was identifiable. Every person in the room knew it. Craig Sutton's neck went red first, then his jaw. That recording is illegally obtained. It won't survive a motion to suppress. It doesn't need to survive a motion to suppress, Diana said. It needs to survive this room. And it already has. She looked at the executives on both sides of the table, not accusingly, with something more difficult than accusation, genuine curiosity. Did any of you ask why we were selling to an oil company? Did anyone in this room request an independent valuation? Did anyone here think it was unusual that the founder and majority shareholder had not been consulted? The room offered nothing. Most men looked at the table. 2 looked at the wall. One younger man near the door looked at his hands, as if he had only just noticed he had them. Then, from the left side of the table, a man Diana barely remembered. Arthur Bain, 60. A board member she had met once at an annual dinner, pushed back his chair and stood. I want it on record, he said, that I voted against this transaction from the beginning. He turned his laptop to face the room. On the screen was an email from Craig Sutton, sent 11 months ago, 2 lines. Vote yes on Titan, or we revisit your consulting contract. You know what that means. I was threatened, Arthur said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. I want it documented. 2 other board members reached for their folders almost simultaneously. The dam, which had been holding for 14 months, gave way in under 40 seconds. Diana watched it happen, without satisfaction. She had learned long ago that the unraveling of dishonest systems brought something closer to grief than triumph. Grief for the version of this company that should have existed and didn't. She stood. She placed both hands flat on the table. Victor Caldwell and Craig Sutton are terminated, effective immediately, for gross fiduciary misconduct, material misrepresentation, charter violation, and conspiracy to defraud shareholders. She looked at Caldwell directly. Security will escort you from this building within 30 minutes. Your system access is being revoked as I speak. Priya's team on 29 has the order. Any attempt to remove proprietary information will be prosecuted. Caldwell's mouth moved, but what came out was barely a sentence. You'll destroy everything. You've been gone 6 years. You don't understand what this company is anymore. I built it, Diana said. I understand exactly what it is. As the security guards arrived and Caldwell was walked toward the door, he turned once more and looked at her with the specific expression of a man who needs the last word and cannot locate one. You only won today because of luck, he said. Not because you're better. He said it the way people say things they believe are true. Diana did not respond. She didn't need to, because Zoe Washington, a 22-year-old black intern standing just outside the glass wall of the boardroom, had been holding her phone up for the last 45 seconds, and every word Victor Caldwell had just said was already traveling outward at the speed of the internet. The IT security center on the 29th floor looked, at that moment, like the bridge of a ship in a storm. 6 engineers sat at a curved bank of monitors, their faces lit blue-white by cascading alert windows, their voices low and rapid and concentrated. Diana walked in with Owen Reeves beside her and Gerald Ford's USB drive in her jacket pocket. And the lead engineer, a young South Asian woman named Priya, who had the particular calm of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of emergency, looked up and said, without preamble, "We caught it." Barely. The revocation process had been initiated the moment Diana invoked the Phoenix Clause, but in a system of that scale, full lockdown required a manual confirmation sequence that took 11 minutes to complete. Sutton had known that. He had counted on it. The deletion order had been sent from Craig Sutton's credentials at 9:58 a.m., 6 minutes after Diana invoked the Phoenix Clause, which meant Sutton had pulled out his phone in the elevator on the way out of the building and triggered it remotely. The target was the entire clean energy battery division. 7 years of research, 4 pending patents, the prototype files for a solid-state battery technology that 3 independent analysts had called the most significant development in grid-scale storage in a decade. If the system lockdown had taken 30 more seconds, Priya said, we would have lost 80% of it. Diana pulled out the USB drive. This was given to me this morning by Gerald Ford. He was your chief engineer until 2 years ago. Priya looked at the drive. Something moved across her face. Recognition. Then something more complicated. Mr. Ford was the one who architected our backup encryption. Before they let him go, he made a copy, Diana said. 3 months ago, he believed this day was coming. Priya took the drive, inserted it, and after 30 seconds said quietly, "It's everything. Complete. Time-stamped." Across the room, another engineer raised her hand. Miss Monroe. Someone attempted to access the client database at 10:03. External IP. We blocked it at 31 seconds of connection time, which means they may have gotten partial data, but nothing complete. We've rotated all credentials and put the system in full lockdown. I want a complete audit, Diana said. Every file accessed, copied, or moved in the last 8 months. Every administrator privilege. I want to know who knew what and when. She stepped back into the hallway. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. Financial journalists, board members, her own attorney, who had apparently seen the first wave of social media coverage and was having the specific kind of morning that made attorneys earn their retainer. The stock had dropped 15% before 10:30. She called Douglas Hart, CEO of Titan Fuel Corporation, from the hallway without sitting down. He picked up on the third ring. She said, "The Caldwell deal is dead. I'm calling as a courtesy, not a negotiation." Hart was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he did not argue. "Miss Monroe," he said, "I knew who you were when Caldwell first brought this to us. He told me you were gone for good. That a woman like you," he paused, and she heard him making a calculation, "wouldn't come back once you'd stepped away. I believed him because it was easier to believe him. And now? Now I'd like to formally withdraw Titan Fuel from any interest in Apex Clarity. And I want you to know what Caldwell told me about you. The way he described you, I should have pushed back on it. I didn't. That's on me." Diana said, "I'm recording this call." Hart said, "I know." She ended the call. Owen was standing a few feet away. He had heard everything. "Is that enough?" he asked. "It's a start," she said. Then she went back to work. She met with 43 people over the next 3 days. Not in the boardroom. She had not been back to the boardroom since the morning everything changed. She sat in conference rooms and break rooms, and once, memorably, in the building's rooftop terrace with a senior mechanical engineer who said he was more comfortable talking where the walls couldn't hear him, and Diana decided that was a reasonable concern and did not argue. What she heard over those 3 days was not surprising. It was painful in the particular way that confirmed fears are painful, not shocking but clarifying, like a photograph coming into focus to reveal something you had half known and half refused to believe. The mission had been hollowed out. Under Caldwell's tenure, the clean energy focus had been systematically deprioritized in favor of licensing revenue and short-term margin improvement. 3 senior researchers had resigned in the last 2 years after being told their projects were not strategically aligned. The phrase kept recurring in Diana's notes. 3 different people. Same words, same tone. The language of an organization that had learned to dress retreat in the costume of strategy. 12 employees had filed internal complaints about management practices in the last 18 months. None had received a written response. 2 had been let go within 60 days of filing. She was still absorbing all of this when Sophie Reyes found her in the hallway outside the human resources floor, waiting with the posture of someone who had rehearsed an approach and then abandoned the script. "Miss Monroe." Diana stopped. Sophie's composure from the morning, the professional smoothness, the quiet assessment, was gone. What was in its place was more interesting and more valuable. Uncertainty. Genuine discomfort with herself. "I owe you an apology. Not just because of who you are, because of what I did." She met Diana's eyes and held them. "I looked at you this morning and I made a decision before I knew your name. Before I asked your name. I did it without thinking. Which is," she paused, "which is the problem, isn't it? I just did what I've always done. What this building trained me to do." Diana looked at her for a long moment. "You're not the villain in this story, Sophie. I know. That's what worries me. It's easier to fix a villain." "Tell me something," Diana said. "Do you want to be part of what this company is supposed to be? Not what it was under Caldwell, what it was before that." Sophie straightened. "Yes." That afternoon, Brittany Cole knocked on the door of the temporary office Diana had set up on the 32nd floor. She came in and sat down without being asked, which Diana noted was a different posture than the one she'd had at the reception desk that morning. She had been crying recently, though she was composed now. "I've been sitting at that desk for 3 years, Brittany said, "and I've looked at 100 people the way I looked at you this morning. Maybe 1,000. She folded her hands in her lap. "I never thought of it as racism. I thought I was just reading the room, doing my job." Diana set down her pen. This conversation mattered more than the 43 others. Not because Brittany Cole was more important, but because Brittany Cole was the most honest. "That's what makes it so effective," Diana said. "It doesn't feel like a decision. It just feels like noticing things, like using your instincts. But your instincts were trained by a world that taught you what certain kinds of people look like. And you never questioned the training." Brittany was quiet. "How do I unlearn it?" "You've already started," Diana said. "You came in here and named it. Most people never get that far. The rest is just paying attention. Every single time. For the rest of your life." That evening, Diana sat alone in what had once been Thomas's office, the office she had not entered in 6 years, and looked at a photograph she had brought from Cape Cod. The two of them, 2007, standing in front of the warehouse on Westheimer Road, squinting into late afternoon sun, laughing at something the photographer had said. She set it on the desk and looked at it for a long time. "I think some of them remember," she said to the photograph. "We just have to give them a reason to act like it." She had not planned to give a speech. That was the honest truth. What she had planned was a memo, clear, direct, professionally warm, the kind of communication that acknowledged reality without dramatizing it. Owen had suggested the all-hands meeting. He had said, quietly and without pressure, that the people in this building had spent 3 days watching the news, reading social media speculation, and wondering whether they were going to have jobs by the weekend, and that they deserved to hear from her directly, not from a document. She had agreed because he was right, and because one of the things she had tried to do for 54 years was agree with people when they were right, regardless of whether agreeing was comfortable. She stood at the podium in the main atrium of Monroe Center on a Thursday morning. 10,000 employees gathered in the space below her and on the mezzanine levels above, with thousands more watching via live stream from Apex Clarity offices in 9 other cities. The room was the quietest large room she had ever stood in. She looked out at the faces, young and old, black and white and brown, and every gradation between engineers and administrators, and people who kept the building running in ways that never appeared in org charts. All of them waiting for something she wasn't entirely sure she knew how to give them. She thought of Gerald Ford, who had driven a cab for 2 years waiting for this chance. She thought of Owen Reeves, who had been pushed to the end of the table for months because he wouldn't lie. She thought of Arthur Bain, who had been threatened into silence and finally found his voice at the last possible moment. She thought of Zoe Washington, 22 years old. Phone raised, unwavering. She began. 9 days ago, I walked into this building for the first time in 6 years. No one recognized me. I was asked to wait in the hallway. She let that sit. I sat in that hallway for 8 minutes. And in those 8 minutes, I watched 3 white men in suits walk past the reception desk without being asked for an appointment. I watched a security guard position himself near my chair for reasons that had nothing to do with security. I watched a camera that had been turned away from where I sat so that whatever happened to me there would not be recorded. Her voice stayed level. She had decided, a long time ago, that the most powerful way to say a hard thing was plainly. None of those people meant to be cruel. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. The woman who told me to wait didn't think she was being racist. She thought she was reading the room. She was reading a room that had been arranged, deliberately and over years, to make certain people invisible. And she had learned to see what that room wanted her to see. She paused. That is what systemic bias actually looks like. Not a slur, not a burning cross, just a room that has been arranged, and a person who has learned to read it, and no one stopping to ask why it was arranged that way in the first place. She looked out at the 10,000 faces. Thomas Garrett and I built this company in 2007 inches a warehouse with no air conditioning and a card table and a shared conviction that clean energy technology could actually change how the world runs. Thomas was a white man from Wyoming, and I was a black woman from Houston. And every investor we met looked at Thomas when they had a question for me. Every contract we signed had his name called out first at the table. And every single time, Thomas would stop and say, "Actually, you should be asking Diana." Every single time. For 15 years. Her voice softened almost imperceptibly. He is gone. But that instinct, that reflexive, deliberate correction of a world that gets it wrong, that does not get to go with him. She straightened. I am not here today to punish anyone. I am here to rebuild something. The leadership of this company will be reconstituted on one principle: value. Not appearances, not credentials designed to impress, not connections. Value. What you create, what you protect, what you refuse to destroy, even when it costs you. That is what this company has always been built on. She thought of Gerald Ford in the cab, pressing the USB drive into her hand. Some of you took enormous risks to protect what this company is. You stayed quiet in rooms that made silence a condition of survival. You backed up files at midnight. You sent anonymous emails to a woman you weren't sure was ever coming back. She looked out at the crowd. I came back, and I see you. The applause began somewhere in the middle of the room and spread outward, and Diana stood at the podium and let it wash over her, and did not let herself cry, because she had promised herself she would not do that here, in front of 10,000 people. She saved it for later. She was good at saving things for later. She had been doing it her whole life. 6 weeks after the morning, everything changed. Diana Monroe walked through the lobby of Monroe Center on a Tuesday and stopped. She stopped because of Zoe Washington. Zoe was standing in front of a photograph that had been reinstalled on the lobby wall 10 days earlier. A large framed print from 2007, Diana and Thomas Garrett outside the Westheimer Road warehouse, squinting into the late afternoon sun. Beneath it, a simple engraved placard, founded by Diana Monroe and Thomas Garrett, Houston, Texas, 2007. Zoe was studying it with the concentrated attention of someone trying to memorize something. She was wearing a new employee badge that read Apex Clarity Leadership Development Program, Cohort 1, a program that had not existed 3 weeks ago. Diana had announced it the day after the all-hands speech, along with 12 inaugural spots selected from a pool of candidates who had previously been rejected by Caldwell's HR apparatus for what their files described as cultural fit concerns. Zoe had been rejected twice, both times flagged in the system with the phrase cultural fit concerns and no further elaboration. She had applied a third time to a different division entirely, and the mid-level manager who reviewed her application had noted the prior rejections, read the phrase cultural fit concerns, and, having filed his own internal complaint 6 months earlier that had received no response, decided that was not a reason he recognized as legitimate, and hired her anyway. Zoe heard Diana's footsteps and turned. She looked at Diana with the directness of someone who had decided, at some point recently, to be done with being indirect. Miss Monroe. Zoe. I wanted to say, she stopped, recalibrated, started again. The clip. I didn't post it to go viral. I needed there to be a record. I couldn't stand that it might just disappear. That he'd say that to you, and it would just vanish like it never happened. Diana looked at her. 22 years old, black, sharp as a wire, standing in the lobby of a company that had tried 3 times to keep her out. You understood something instinctively that takes most people years to learn, Diana said. That power depends on there being no record. The first act of reclamation is documentation. Zoe nodded slowly, absorbing this. What do I do with that? As someone who's just starting out, in rooms where I'm going to be the only person who looks like me. Diana thought about that for a moment. She thought about the lobby nearly 2 decades ago, the way it had looked when she and Thomas had first stood in it together, the warm wood panels, the portrait of no one yet because no one had been sure the company would survive long enough to justify a portrait. She thought about every room she had walked into in her life and been the only one, and the cost of that, and the strange, specific education of it. You see everyone who walks through that door, Diana said. Every single person. You ask their name before you decide what they're worth. You give people 8 minutes of your attention before you make any decision about who they are. She looked at Zoe directly. And when someone tells you that you don't belong in a room, you sit down at the head of the table and you ask them to explain themselves. That evening, Diana flew back to Cape Cod. She had an Apex Clarity board meeting in Houston in 3 weeks, and another 3 weeks after that, and a schedule that looked, for the first time in 6 years, like the schedule of someone who intended to stay. She let herself in through the back door of the house, walked through the kitchen, and sat down at her desk. There were 47 unread emails. She ignored them. There was a glass of water she had left on the desk that morning that she drank now, standing up, looking at the Atlantic through the back window. Then she sat down and opened her laptop and saw it, an email from Thomas Garrett. The address was the one the company had maintained at her request since his death. She had never been able to bring herself to deactivate it. The timestamp showed it had been sent that morning at 9:52 a.m. Scheduled delivery. He had set it to send on the day she came back. Patricia Shaw had told her once, years ago, that Thomas had left 3 sealed instructions with the board secretary, each tied to a different condition. The day Diana returned to Houston, the day the company reached 10,000 employees, and a third one Patricia had never opened and said she never would. Diana looked at the timestamp for a long moment. 9:52 a.m. was not the exact moment she had invoked the Phoenix Clause. That had been 9:52 and 31 seconds, according to Patricia's confirmation log. It was close enough to feel like more than coincidence, and far enough apart to remain, in the end, simply human. He had not known the precise moment. He had known her. She opened it. The body of the email contained one line. I knew you'd come back. I always did. Diana Monroe sat very still at her desk for a long moment. Through the window, the Atlantic moved in its slow and indifferent way. She placed her hand flat over her heart, and for the first time since the 8 longest minutes of her life, she let herself cry. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment telling me which moment hit hardest, and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now.
Diana Monroe didn't storm back. She didn't announce herself. She simply showed up quiet, prepared, and absolutely certain of who she was. She sat inside her way for 8 minutes while men issued works back unchallenged. She watched the camera deliberately turn away from where she sat. She felt the weight of a world that had spent years trying to convince her she no longer belonged. And then she stood up. Here what her story teaches us: power is not taken from you when people ignore you. It's only curious when you believe them. Diana never surrendered. She came back with evidence, with button, with the name of every person who had risked something to hold the truth alive for her. rather in the club away at the end of the table, there with her phone right. Because that is all the truth this story carries. You are never flying alone. Somewhere, someone is saving the file. Someone is refusing the illegal instruction. Someone is standing at the far end of the room, waiting for you to walk the door. Do not make them wait forever. With something worth protects what you are building. And when the war easy, your name come back and why is again.